My name is George Jarrow. I'm the Director of the Behavioral Health Unit at Dominican Hospital and the Chair of the Symposium Planning Committee. Today's event is being recorded for cablecast by Community Television of Santa Cruz County. It'll be broadcast at a future date on the channels wherever you locally get them. Sometimes the Capitola, it's different than Santa Cruz, 24, 25. If you're looking for a copy of this performance or an informational presentation, you can contact Community Television directly. For a fee, they will produce a DVD for you. And now I'd like to introduce to you Joshua Nadherny.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of myself and my family, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 8th Annual Jon E. Nadherny Calciano Memorial Symposium. I would like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I know giving up your Fridays and the crappy weather, but we would greatly appreciate it. You know, this event is not easy to plan, and I'd like to thank the planning committee who gives up their time every month to make sure that the topics are right and everything flows smoothly. So if the planning committee could please rise and be acknowledged at this time. In particular, I'd like to thank Alita Canali and her group of volunteers who work frantically the last couple of weeks of this event to make sure that everyone gets registered and everything flows very smoothly. So I thank you for that. This symposium was started 8 years ago with the intention of remembering my brother, Jon. He was 23 when he passed away. He had just finished college. He had his whole life ahead of him. Over the years, I've often wondered what his life would be like today. Would he have had a family? Would he have had a career he loved? Would he have been happy? Fortunately, I will never know. What happened to my brother was a tragedy. But what is more tragic is that it continues to happen to families every day through violence, drugs, and suicide. The goal of this symposia has always been to provide world-class training to you to help you better prepare for in your jobs. Many of you over the years have come up and thanked me and members of my family for putting on this symposia. How you say how something like this is so desperately needed. I say thank yourselves. You are the ones that make this symposium possible. You are on the front lines and you deal with these issues day in and day out. I have always felt that this symposia is only as strong as those who attend it. And I think today really exemplifies that with over 475 in attendance. Today is like a dream come true for my mother and myself. It goes beyond our highest expectations. And in the words of my mother, these symposia are a wonderful legacy and give a real sense of purpose to Jon's life. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Dr. Richard Rawson. Dr. Rawson received a PhD in experimental physiology from the University of Vermont in 1974. Since that time, he has spent his career conducting research and developing systems for treating individuals with substance abuse disorders. Dr. Rawson has been a member of the UCLA Department of Psychiatry for over 20 years and is currently an adjunct associate professor and the associate director of the UCLA Integrated Substance Abuse Programs. In this role, Dr. Rawson oversees a portfolio of addiction research ranging from brain imaging studies to numerous clinical trials on pharmacological and physiological addiction treatments, to the study of how new treatments are applied in the treatment system. During the past decade, he has worked with the U.S. State Department on large substance abuse research and treatment projects regarding the U.S. technology, addiction sciences to Mexico, Thailand, Israel, Egypt, South America, and the Palestinian Authority. I had a chance to meet with and talk with him, and he's actually going to Iraq to help set up the drug abuse programs there. He is currently principal investigator of the Pacific Southwest Technology Transfer Group, the NIDA, Methamphetamine Clinical Trial Group, and the co-P of the Pacific Node of the NIDA, CTN. Dr. Rawson has published 2 books, 20 chapters, and over 115 professional papers, and has conducted over 1,000 workshops, presentations, and training sessions. He was raised on a dairy farm in Vermont, and despite over 25 years of California residence, he is a hopeless Red Sox fan. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rawson.
Good afternoon. Hi. This is a great event. Done a lot of talks. I don't think I've ever done any in a place quite like this before. But before I start, I apologize if you've heard that there's a laryngitis thing going around. Well, I happen to have it. And the last 2 days, I haven't been able to talk at all. This is the first day I've been able to talk since Tuesday, I guess. So I'm going to try to be gentle on my voice to make sure I get through the 2 hours. But is this carrying okay in the back? Can people hear? Okay, good. I would like to thank particularly George Jaro, who's been my contact person in organizing this. He's been really helpful in setting this all up. The travel schedule has been a bit of a challenge over the last few months. We've been doing our group. This methamphetamine thing has really been something we've been working on now for 20 years, and all of a sudden it's now become the next big thing. I don't know if you saw in the news today, but the Patriot Act that was passed by the Senate yesterday has money in it for methamphetamine activities, most of which will involve restricting precursor chemicals, but there actually is some money for treatment and an increase in drug court funding. So you'll probably be hearing something on that, as it's taken the federal government about 20 years to figure out that methamphetamine is a problem. We've been trying to get this on their agenda for the last 10 years, but particularly in the last 6 years, the issue has been marijuana that the federal government's focused on, and they haven't really seen methamphetamine as a problem, but hopefully that's starting to change. In addition to what's happening here in the U.S., we're involved in a lot of international work. I go to Vienna tomorrow to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, where we're doing work on methamphetamine with them. In some parts of the world, like South Africa, methamphetamine rates are increasing dramatically in an area with high rates of HIV. And as I'll talk about, one of the aspects of methamphetamine that is problematic is its tremendous link with sexual behavior. And it drives high rates of sexual behavior, which in groups that have high existing rates of HIV is not a good thing. So it has developed itself now as a big international problem. Well, let me give you some information about the drug, some of the new knowledge we have on how the drug affects the body and the brain, and then some clinical information and some information about treatment. In case my voice should give out, I want to say one thing about meth and treatment. I spend about 2/3 of my time in airports and hotels now talking to groups about methamphetamine treatment, and I'm usually like in third or fourth speaker, and usually by the time I get up, someone has said, and of course we need to make sure methamphetamine is not a problem in our community because meth users are untreatable, that fewer than 5% get well. And that's a commonly held belief in much of the country, that meth users don't respond to treatment. That's absolutely wrong and is inaccurate. Treatment outcome with meth users is approximately the same as we see for most groups of substance abusers, cocaine and alcohol in particular, and probably, except for the fact that we have methadone for treating heroin users, the treatment outcome is better than with heroin users if you take away methadone or buprenorphine. So one myth I would like to eliminate right away is that meth users don't get well. They do get well. There are some aspects of their treatment that need to be adjusted, and hopefully I can give you some information on that. This is a drug that's been around here in California for a long time. It was here when I first started doing work in the field in the early 70s. It was used then as pharmaceutical amphetamine. You could get prescriptions of it. Diet doctors would write prescriptions and you could get amphetamine. Laws were passed in the early 70s that restricted the use of amphetamine for medical purposes to where it's now only available for hyperactive kids and a few severe intractable depression conditions. So you don't see a lot of pharmaceutical amphetamine on the street anymore, but what happened in the early 70s was the production of methamphetamine was taken over by biker groups. Here in this area, in fact, here and in the Fontana, San Bernardino area were the two big pockets of it. And for about 10 years, that was about the only place we saw much meth use, was in the Bay Area here and in the Inland Empire in San Bernardino, Riverside, San Diego, eastern San Diego County, where biker gangs would make it and carry it around in the crankcases of their motorcycle, and hence the term crank that's used. The other terms for it up there, crystal meth, crank, tina. It's often called tina in the gay community. Yaba, speed, all of those are terms for the same drug. It has different looks. It looks, depending on the recipe you use and the ingredients you use, it can be any of those colors. It can be pink. It can be St. Patrick's Day. Sometimes we see green meth. But it's manufactured in a variety of places. And by about the mid-1980s, here in California, it started to spread. We started to see it spread in Southern California, throughout the whole desert region. The cookers started being different groups. We started having more than just motorcycle gangs cooking it. They started using new methods where they switched from ephedrine to pseudoephedrine. And so the use of it and the production of it became much more widespread. In 1986, our group, I've been doing addiction research since 1973. For the decade of the 70s was mostly on heroin. And in beginning first half of the 80s was on cocaine. And we actually had an office in Beverly Hills where we do a lot of work with, in the early 80s, that's who was using cocaine, were people mostly in the entertainment industry and rich people, because it was expensive to get cocaine. But in 85, 86 actually, we saw the San Bernardino County Health Department ask us to come and open an office in Rancho Cucamonga, because they said there was a huge methamphetamine problem, which was sort of surprising because most of the country was seeing massive amounts of cocaine at that point. But we opened an office there, and we've now seen since then about 8,000 methamphetamine users over the last 20 years. We just hit the 20-year anniversary for that office. So it's been a problem in some parts of the country. Here in this area, you've seen it for a long time. This is no big news to you, I'm sure, that meth is a problem. Throughout California, it is the drug problem in California. There are more meth users that enter treatment than all other categories of drug users combined. So it is a huge problem in California. We started seeing people bringing it in, mostly into Hawaii, in this form called ice. Was smoked. Back when I first started seeing meth users, about 2/3 of them snorted the drug and about 1/4 of them injected, and a few took it orally and a few smoked it. One of the big changes we've seen in the last 20 years is that about 2/3 of the users now smoke it. This form, ice, which came in from the Philippines during the 80s and came into Hawaii, really kicked off the whole smoking method of use. And Hawaii's had a very bad meth problem for as long as we have here in California. In fact, it may even be worse in Hawaii than here. You don't hear much about it on the news. They don't publicize it because it's not good for the tourist industry, but it really is, it's devastating the native Hawaiian community and really has caused them huge amounts of criminal justice and health care problems. And this is the way that it showed up there, was in the form of ice. This slide I just updated. I don't have it on this lecture, but the next 3 points, 2001, 2002, 2003, take a sharp upward turn. And so the rate of treatment admissions really has escalated rapidly across the country in the last 5 years. We've been trying to get, as I said, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy to respond to this, but they have not been particularly responsive. But we're now seeing, not just in California, but throughout the country, this is a problem. Worldwide, methamphetamine is the largest illicit drug problem except for cannabis. It's estimated that there's about 42 million meth users worldwide, more than all the heroin and cocaine users combined. The states that have meth problems traditionally have been West Coast states. The ones where we had the really high rates of treatment admissions have been mostly in the West or Midwest, but that's changing. Hawaii and California have led the way with, actually Oregon, Hawaii, and California, but we're seeing substantial amounts now in the Midwest as well. To show you how meth can affect a community in terms of affecting the healthcare system, these are data from Indian Health Services, Phoenix office. And this is what they showed in the change of treatment admissions. These aren't coming in for treatment for meth. They're coming in for medical problems into an outpatient clinic, and they're just counting the number of people who mention meth as one of the issues that is going on with them medically. You get an idea of the rate at which the problem can expand in an area. And in fact, it actually occurs even more quickly than this. You don't really see it reflected by medical problems as quickly as you would with a drug like heroin. When heroin moves into a community, you know about it from the statistics real quickly because you start seeing overdose deaths. You don't see that with meth. You can die from meth overdoses, certainly, but the people who see meth first in communities are the police. They see the users, they see the crime that's involved with it, they see the psychotic people they have to take into the emergency rooms, they see the cooking, the labs. If we'd paid more attention to the police reports about methamphetamine and responded to those more quickly, we might have actually prevented some communities from being in the problem they're in, because police data have really been reflecting this now over the last 20 years. The meth is a big problem. It just that their voice has not been listened to in terms of this coming problem. Now that we're seeing people enter treatment, we're starting to pay attention. Unfortunately, it takes the average meth user 7 years to enter treatment. So by the time you see treatment admissions go up, you've got a really big problem in your community because it's been there for 7 years or so. Police see it first, and they're the ones that are really the best early indicators of drug problems in communities. This is how it's spread. If you look at this, these graphs of these states, the states that are the red colored are those that have elevated numbers of treatment admissions for methamphetamine. And as you can see, going from 92 to 97, you pretty much fill up all the western and midwestern states west of the Mississippi River. By 2002, you add a couple of other states, Indiana and Alabama. And if I had my 2004 slide, you would see virtually, which is lost somewhere, you would see virtually the entire country except for the Northeast, except for Washington to Maine. The rest of the country now has a substantial meth problem. A lot of the time we're doing training now is in the southeastern United States, in the Carolinas, in Virginia, Mississippi, and Alabama. They're starting to see it a lot in upper Midwest, Indiana, Michigan, and that area. So in many ways, the way I feel is that we've sat here and watched it move from California right across the country and done very little about getting in front of the epidemic. We now respond with treatment dollars. It seems to me as though it would have been helpful had we responded with prevention dollars out in front of the problem. One of we have a lot of data from police on the labs and the lab problems those are, particularly concerning in communities that have labs, because although meth obviously creates health and social service problems, the labs themselves create problems because of the production of toxic waste, the danger to police officers, the danger to children who are exposed to labs. But one of the modest advantages we have over the cookers is that, as I'll show you, meth affects the part of the brain that controls judgment. And many of our meth users, or cookers at least, often show limited judgment in their activities. This is from a Nebraska newspaper, and sheriff's deputies suspected there might be something going on in this house because this tank truck, which is has anhydrous ammonia, was parked on the lawn of this house with a hose running into the kitchen. And anhydrous ammonia really is only used for one thing, which is fertilizer in the fields. Well, it's actually used for two things: fertilizer in the fields and making methamphetamine. So the sheriffs felt they had a tip when they saw the hose going into the kitchen. This gives you some idea about the labs, number of lab takedowns that occur around the country. As you notice, California had 1,800. This was 2002. We're back to number one, but we were embarrassingly number two for a while when Missouri took over. As you see, in 2002, Missouri had 2,200 labs. Nationally, it looks something like this. From 98 to 2003, the increase in the number of labs seized for methamphetamine, where the green part of the graph is rural areas. It's the first drug epidemic we've ever had in the United States where the initial problem has been in rural areas. When we see drugs like cocaine and heroin, they've generally occurred in urban areas, and then they sometimes spread out into more rural areas. Meth has occurred in rural areas first, and that's partly because that's where the labs are. They produce it there, and then they sell it in the neighborhood, and it becomes widely used in the neighborhood. And so the lab problem really has determined in part where the drug shows up. But the drug actually, right now it's estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of all the meth used in the U.S. is manufactured in the large meth labs called super labs that are run by the cartels in Mexico and in California, where they make huge batches of it. In a home lab, you'll make a pound or two. You can make it in about 24 hours. You can buy the ingredients at any place around hardware stores and pharmacies. You can get the necessary ingredients. There's plenty of recipes on the internet. And although we're now restricting the availability of Sudafed, the drug that's used for sinus and cold tablets, which is what you use to make methamphetamine, and that will reduce the number of labs, and that's a good thing. It won't reduce the meth problem because the super labs, once a market is established, whether it's established by large drug dealers or by home labs, once the market's there, the large suppliers will find a way to get the drug there. So I think there's great hopes that if we restrict Sudafed and you can't go in and buy it in your drugstore and take it home and cook up a bunch of meth, that will eliminate the meth problem. Unfortunately, we won't eliminate the meth problem. We'll eliminate meth labs, and that's good, but it's not going to eliminate the problem. This epidemic that we're seeing has been a peculiar epidemic in our drug history. Generally, our epidemics, and if you look at the other ones, some of the other ones we've had, cocaine and PCP in the last 30 years, generally you see a rapid onset of the epidemic. It peaks, something happens, and it goes down. That's what we saw with cocaine. Early 80s, mid 80s, cocaine went up dramatically, peaked in the late 80s, and came down in the 90s. Methamphetamine just keeps going up. That's something that it spreads from west to east, and if you go to communities that have had a problem with meth for a long time, communities like San Diego, Honolulu, Hawaii, Portland, Oregon, the numbers just keep going up. We don't seem to have found a way of slowing it down yet. I'm going to talk about some of the effects on the body. As I mentioned, if you look for overdose deaths to be your main indicator of a problem in a community, you won't see it with meth. Although people do die of overdose deaths, it's not the acute effects that kill people, it's the chronic effects. If you use the drug over time, it will eventually create strokes, heart attacks. You'll see hepatitis C in the gay community. You'll see HIV/AIDS. But it's a drug that wears out the body. It wears out the system over time. These are some of the things it does to the heart. Of course, it raises blood pressure, raises heart rate. Over time, causes thickening of the coronary walls and can damage valves. In the brain, I'll talk a lot about the brain. These are some of the things that it can do acutely. You can get stroke and cerebral hemorrhage, but generally it takes a while for those situations to occur. Because of all the smoking of methamphetamine, we see a lot of respiratory problems. This is new. And again, this is something you see over time. You don't necessarily see it right away. But if you look in the emergency rooms in Honolulu, where they've been working with it now for 20 years, something in the neighborhood of 35 to 40% of their admissions in emergency rooms are meth-related, either meth psychosis or some of these medical problems associated with methamphetamine. In Hawaii, everybody smokes meth. And there they start to see large amounts of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and other chronic lung problems. In addition, there's a whole variety of other medical things that are a good reason to not use methamphetamine. Methamphetamine dries up the secretions in your body, all of them. You don't sweat, you don't get saliva, you don't get tearing in your eyes. And so you'll end up with your eyes getting dry, and people will scratch their eyes and often scratch the cornea and get ulcers in their eyes. Because you don't sweat, your body overheats. And you get, this can be one of the causes of death, is in severe cases you get body temperatures going up to 106 or 107, which can cause death. Rhabdomyolysis, which is a breakdown of muscle tissue. Obstetrical complications, we'll talk more about that. Prenatal effects of methamphetamine. Obviously, weight loss is a desired effect of methamphetamine. It's one of the reasons that some people, particularly women, find methamphetamine an attractive drug because it reduces weight, but then it can move into anorexia, and there is a relatively high comorbidity of meth use and eating disorders. Teeth requires special mention. I guess I didn't put in my nasty pictures of meth mouth, but meth mouth is a real thing. It's the dental problems that occur secondary to chronic methamphetamine use. There have been a number of articles on this. This is a very severe problem. If you talk to dentists in California about what they see with meth use, it's amazing. Apparently, not only do you not have saliva, so your teeth get, your gums get dry, and that's not a good thing. You grind your teeth with methamphetamine use, produces bruxism, which is a grinding of the teeth. The vapor of the smoke has a direct damaging effect on the gums and the teeth. So you get horrible dental cavities and dental disease. It really is unpleasant to look at and costs money to the healthcare systems. State of North Dakota said the healthcare costs in their prisons increased by 20% as a result of methamphetamine dental costs that they've had to incur. In LA County, if you're arrested with possession of methamphetamine, they won't even put you in jail because they don't want to have to fix your teeth. It's too expensive. The jails are just too overcrowded anyway. Speed bumps, you see this, the blisters, skin that people will scratch themselves because, there's a tingling on the surface of the skin from methamphetamine, and once you start using it and you start becoming paranoid and you start becoming psychotic, you'll often believe that there's bugs crawling under your skin, and people will dig themselves up and scratch up their arms and their face. All of that from methamphetamine. Rates of violence with meth use are higher than with some other categories of drugs, although alcohol is still probably the most widely associated with violence. But when people get psychotic from meth and get paranoid and irritable and they haven't slept for 3 days, you start to see violent behavior, irritability. That's why you see so much domestic violence and so much violence against in households with kids, is because they're a tremendous amount of sleep deprivation, psychosis, paranoia, all of those caused universally by methamphetamine. Those aren't rare things. They're virtually universal. And although some of this stuff may not get reported, there's a tremendous amount of trauma and violence associated with meth use. One of the big stories about meth use that has new information is the effect of it on the brain. We've been following this now for about 10 years. Some of my colleagues at UCLA do brain imaging studies, and so we've actually gotten to look at what the drug does to the brain. Now, when somebody first starts experimenting with methamphetamine, they're not taking it because they're addicted or that they feel that they are compelled to take it. They're taking it for the same reason they take other drugs, that they try alcohol or marijuana or take other kinds of risks. They're curious. They're interested. We've looked at some data on why people take their first dose, and it's pretty similar to a lot of other drug-taking behavior, with the exception that among women, much higher proportions of women try it for weight control and relieving depression. Those are both reasons that some women say that they've heard it's useful for that. But anyway, once they take the first dose and the second dose, they like what it does to their brain, particularly if they smoke it, because they get an immediate high that is very powerful. And so their initial dosing of their brain is based on this curiosity or all these other reasons you try something. But once you've tried it, once you put it in your brain, something happens. This is the human brain, composed of somewhere between 10 and 20 billion neurons. The parts of the brain affected by methamphetamine are the judgment area, the reward area, and the memory areas. Those are all directly affected by methamphetamine. Causes a release of brain chemistry in those parts of the brain. There's one other area not shown here called the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional control center. That's also affected by methamphetamine. One of the things methamphetamine does is to produce a release of a brain chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is an important drug in the brain. It's one of the brain's primary pleasure chemicals. When good things happen and you feel good, your brain releases dopamine in the reward center. This shows you a couple of natural rewards. If you put a food-deprived animal in a box and you measure the dopamine with a cannula into their brain, you measure the dopamine level in the reward center, put them in the box and you deliver food and they start to eat, you'll get a dopamine rise. That's the brain saying, good. That's what I needed. That feels good. Similarly, you put a male rat in a box, measuring the dopamine level in the reward center of the brain, introduce a receptive female rat and let them have sex, and you get a spike of dopamine, suggesting that's pleasure, that feels good. That's the drug is the chemicals released in the brain. Dopamine being released in the reward center of the brain feels good, feels very positive. We also use these slides to demonstrate a well-known fact that, see, if with food you get an increase of about 50 units, and with sex you get about 100 units, so forms the basis for the formula that 1 orgasm equals 2 cheeseburgers in terms of dopamine. Anyway, but if you look at, I should probably not do that. I don't have enough voice to go around. I shouldn't be wasting it. But all drugs that people like to take produce some of their effect with dopamine. If you start with the bottom right-hand corner, ethanol alcohol, you take a drink of alcohol and you measure dopamine release, and you get a spike of dopamine that's about 100 units. You look next door at the left-hand panel and you get a similar release with nicotine of about 100 units. If you go up to the cocaine panel in the upper right corner, you get a release of about 350 units, which gives you some understanding of why people, when they smoke crack, what it is about that they like. It's this intense rush of pleasure. And I apologize, you can't see for some reason my slide changed the y-axis to black on the methamphetamine slide. But if you could read that, it goes up to about 1,500. So with methamphetamine, you get a rush that is tremendously greater than normal natural reinforcement. When you take a hit on a meth pipe, it produces a sense of pleasure like nothing that you've experienced before. In many ways, you're cheating the brain. The brain really wasn't designed to do that. The brain was meant to give you, 100, 200 unit bumps, but with methamphetamine, you sort of override that and you get this huge release of dopamine. That's what people like. You can give this to any animal if you allow them to self-administer it, and they'll self-administer it until they die. This is extremely pleasurable, this effect that occurs. You understand when people try that, why they stop doing other things and start to focus on how they get more of this, how they do that more and more often to their brain. Well, that's what happens on an acute basis. That's what happens when you put it in your brain and it feels good and produces that effect. Now, you get that spike effect that occurs, and you get that very rapid onset, and you get that from 2 routes of administration, smoking and injecting. If you take it orally or snort it, it takes a much longer timetable to occur. And that's one of the reasons why people who smoke and inject methamphetamine develop a much stronger craving for the drug. And we see that in their recovery, and I'll show you data. Smokers and injectors are tougher to treat than people who snort it or take it orally, because when you get that huge spike of effect, that's what determines how much craving you will get for an addiction. Drugs that produce a rapid onset and a large onset of dopamine will produce a lot of craving, and so we see that with meth users. And then the drug cocaine, you would see a drop-off in the blood level to a very low level within about an hour. That's the half-life of cocaine. Methamphetamine will last for 8 to 12 hours. So it's much longer lasting than cocaine. So you get this huge spike and then a sustained effect for 8 to 12 hours, which is one of the reasons methamphetamine is relatively economical to use, because it produces a huge effect and a long-lasting effect. When you do this to your brain, it changes the brain. Now, here are some PET scans. These aren't in your packet because the files are too big to email, but this part of the brain right here, these almond-shaped areas, these are the reward centers of the human brain. By the way, this is a PET scan. This is the front of the head, back of the head. This is taken sort of at this kind of a level. It's a picture of the chemistry of the brain. The yellow and red coloring means that you've got adequate normal dopamine circulating in that part of your brain. This brain is the picture of a person with Parkinson's disease. My table doesn't show that, but Parkinson's disease is a destruction of the dopamine system of the brain. It's not related to methamphetamine, but I want to show it to you for a reason. With Parkinson's disease, you actually lose all the dopamine, you actually lose the reward centers of your brain, and you lose the ability to experience pleasure, and it affects other parts of the brain as well. With methamphetamine, this is a methamphetamine user at 1 month into recovery. If you notice, it's not as bad, obviously, as Parkinson's disease. You certainly get some dopamine activity, but the color is much less bright and you don't see any of the red coloring as you do in the normal control. It's down about 40%. That's at 1 month sober. Now, this is the juice that you need to feel good. This is the chemistry you need to experience pleasure. At 1 month into recovery, meth users often report this, what we call anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure. Nothing feels good. And that's in fact a direct result of this. They just don't have enough of the brain's chemistry. So you've got a situation where, this is just another slide of that, you've got a normal control with normal dopamine activity. You've got a meth user at 1 month where you see reduced dopamine activity. And the good news is that if you look at meth users 2 years out, the red and yellow coloring is pretty much back to normal. Don't worry about the holes in your head. It doesn't mean that meth users gives you holes in your head. The interesting part here is taken at a slightly lower level of the brain, but the point is this comes back for the most part. And this is a picture showing 24 months. As I'll show you, within 6 months, we start to see substantial amount of recovery, so that by 6 to 12 months somewhere, it's pretty much back in the normal range. And by 2 years, it's certainly back to what appears to be virtually normal. So the bad news is methamphetamine damages dopamine, reduces dopamine levels. When you're in early recovery, you don't have adequate amounts of dopamine. The good news is, or the better news is, the brain does recover for the most part. But the not so good news is it takes a long time. And if you're walking around with your brain in this condition for 2, 4, 6 months, and you feel that this is the way it's going to feel to be sober for the rest of your life, you understand why meth users often get discouraged, why they feel like this is hopeless, and you have a problem with relapse, which is one of the things that occurs. But if you can talk to them about it and talk to them about the fact that their brain recovers, it can be encouraging information to them to help them stay off methamphetamine. How does that occur? That change that we saw in dopamine here. It occurs by damaging neurons. This neuron, this is incoming information, cell body, outgoing information, and the neuron terminal. At the terminal, in the reward center of the brain, this is what you've got going on. This is the terminal of the neuron. You've got dopamine sitting in these little packets ready to be released. If you win the lottery, what happens is your brain sends a signal down, dopamine is released, crosses the synapse, attaches on these receptors, causes this guy to fire, and you experience pleasure if that's happening in the reward center of your brain. Sort of like this. Releases, attaches on the receptor, sits there for a couple of milliseconds, and then it actually gets recycled back into the neuron to be used again. Your brain recycles dopamine. These are called reuptake pumps. They pull the dopamine out of the synapse and reuse it, put it back in the vesicles. That's how the neuron's supposed to work. Stimulants, release dopamine, stimulate the next neuron, get recycled back for use again. Now, if you take cocaine, all cocaine does is to block this. Cocaine doesn't release dopamine. All cocaine does is that after you've released dopamine, it doesn't get taken out of the synapse. And so it builds up here, causing this neuron to keep firing way longer than it's supposed to. And if that's a reward neuron and it keeps firing longer than it's supposed to, you experience pleasure. And if you take more cocaine, you get more pleasure. That's how cocaine works. Methamphetamine actually has a similar mechanism. It blocks reuptake, but methamphetamine actually goes it one step further. Methamphetamine crosses into the neuron, goes into the vesicle, causes a release of dopamine in the terminal, and actually causes a buildup of dopamine in the synapse. So what we see are very high levels of dopamine occurring. That's what that 1500 number is a result of, is that methamphetamine goes in here, causes a release of dopamine out to here, and then blocks its reuptake for 8 to 12 hours. So you get this very long-lasting effect. Well, when you put methamphetamine in here and cause the dopamine to be released into the terminal space, it poisons the neuron. You actually get terminal death. You lose the terminals. What you actually see, if you think of the two neurons coming together like this, what happens with methamphetamine is you lose terminals, so that you still have the neuron, it doesn't die. For the most part, the neurons aren't killed, but they lose their terminals, so they don't have the ability to release dopamine anymore. If that happens over time, before long in the reward center of your brain, you don't have any dopamine being released because you don't have any terminals to release dopamine. What we think happens, what we think occurs over this 4 to 6 months is that these guys regrow. So what you actually have is a healing of the brain. But while that's going on, you don't feel very good. And it's not just in the reward center of the brain, it affects other areas of the brain. This, I'll just do this quickly. This is an early slide that we've used for a long time. This is with monkeys. These dots up here, these are the reward centers in the monkey brain. Dopamine in the monkey brain, as evidenced by these dots. If you give monkeys methamphetamine for 10 days and then test them at a month, compare the difference between these dots and this. Pretty much the lights are out. There's no dopamine activity after a month. After 6 months, there's still no dopamine activity. But at a year and 2 years, you start to see it come back. We think that's the regrowth of the neurons, which is a good thing. But the problem is, for 4 to 6 months, you're just not feeling very good. And it's not just in the reward center of the brain. This is a functional MRI of the brain. This is the area of the brain that controls judgment. This is a part of the brain that tells you what's a good idea. If you're standing on the sidewalk and you're thinking about crossing in front of the traffic and you see cars coming, this is the part of the brain that says, don't step in front of the car. Inhibit your behavior. Don't do that. With meth users, this is a meth user at 1 month into recovery. This blue area is an indication of almost no blood flow into that part of the brain, which means functionally that part of the brain really isn't working. So the part of the brain that controls judgment, teaching you or giving you what you should and shouldn't do, is pretty much switched off in meth users for about at least the first month. We haven't followed this over time. We don't know how long this takes to recover, although it does appear to recover. At the same time, this area of the brain is called the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional control center. And this red coloring means it's hyperactive. It's more active than normal. This is the irritability, the anxiety, the depression, the emotionality you see with meth users in early recovery, where they don't know what's wrong. They know they just don't feel good, and they're anxious, and they can't sleep, and all of that. That's a result of hyperactivity in the amygdala. So for the meth user, this, by the way, also is probably, if you were going to identify a location in the brain where craving occurs, it's probably the amygdala. So if you think about it, you got a brain that isn't, the judgment center shut off and the craving center is turned up. And so it really is sort of the worst case scenario for someone trying to not do something, to refrain from a behavior. Methamphetamine really is a drug that gives us a real understanding of addiction as a brain disease. People who are meth users who are in recovery are struggling not only with all the problems in their life and all the wreckage of the past and all the things they've done, they're also operating with a brain that's not working. And part of our understanding of the treatment of meth users has to do with understanding the deficits they have and the timetable of their recovery. We do know they recover. The problem is it takes a long time, which is one of the reasons why these data have been used to argue for longer funding for meth users, that putting somebody in a short-term treatment for a meth user is probably not likely to do much because the brain recovery is going to take months, not weeks. All right, who are some of the other people damaged by methamphetamine other than the users themselves? Kids are affected. Kids who live around labs in these mom and pop or fondly known Beavis and Butthead labs that we have throughout California. It's estimated that in some cases, some areas, 80 to 90% of the labs that are seized have children under the age of 15 living in them. If you test those kids with a swab or a urine test, about a third of them will test positive for methamphetamine, just by living in that environment. The vapor from cooking methamphetamine has a high purity of methamphetamine in the vapor itself, and it sinks to the floor. It's a heavy vapor. So if you're a little kid crawling around on the floor in a house where meth is being cooked, you're going to get a pretty good dose just from the vapor, not to mention the powder that's laying around or other ways you can come in incidental contact with it. It's not to say these kids are using methamphetamine, it's that they're exposed and they actually get a dose of it through passive absorption. I'll go through some of these quickly. There's some data on different places have different rates at which kids are in labs, but the fact is far too many kids are exposed in labs. It was estimated somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 kids were taken out of labs in the United States last year. We have no idea what being exposed to methamphetamine as a 2-year-old over a period of months does to you, but we suspect it's probably not a good outcome, whatever it is. So we now have something called the DEC teams, which are drug endangered children teams, which have been a really important innovation so that when law enforcement goes in and takes down labs, often it will have healthcare people with them to take the kids out and immediately get the kids into some kind of better environment, whether foster care or in some other safer environment. We're just starting to look at the data on what are the medical and long-term psychiatric effects of this exposure to kids. It'll be tough to tell, though, because obviously if you're a kid living in a meth lab, the only bad thing that's happening to you is not just that you're being exposed to methamphetamine. You're exposed to all the insanity and the violence and the being up all night and the psychosis and all that stuff that goes along with it. So we suspect that there probably will be detectable effects on kids of being exposed to meth labs. We just don't have the data yet. Prenatally, though, we're starting to get some data. Methamphetamine, there was just a report out last week that in areas with substantial meth use, which California certainly would qualify, somewhere between 5 to 10% of all pregnant women showing up in health centers test positive for meth. So meth use by pregnant women is not a rare event. In Hawaii, it's around 11%. In some communities in Hawaii, it's over a third of the women are testing positive. Barry Lester from Brown University is currently conducting a large-scale study on the prenatal effects of methamphetamine. Barry is a pediatrician who is the guy who brought some sanity to the whole issue of cocaine and crack effects on kids, the whole crack baby phenomenon in the 80s. Basically reporting that crack cocaine, or any cocaine, when taken by a pregnant woman, does affect the fetus, but most of the effects appear to be reversible, and these are not throwaway human beings. There was starting to be real hysteria in the 80s about crack cocaine producing this generation of mutants that we would just need to lock up, right away because they were going to be damaged. Their brains would be damaged, and they wouldn't be able to be, productive human beings. And Barry Lester's data were the data that really brought some sanity to that information. That yes, it does create damage. Yes, it's a bad thing to do from a health point of view, but no, it doesn't produce throwaway human beings. His data on meth effects look very similar. He's now followed about a cohort of 500 kids out to 2 years. He'll be following them probably till they're adults to track the effects of meth prenatally. He has measured effects. You can see, obviously, there's associated with small for gestational size. They're born early. You have a higher rate of premature deliveries. And you see some neurobehavioral response, different acoustic behavior. They tend to not be as vocal as non-methamphetamine exposed babies, but the jury's still out on this. His point of view is that we should be worrying about treating women for meth dependence, and that rather than getting hysterical over this. And although I did see that in the state of Idaho last week, the state Senate passed a law making it a mandatory felony for a pregnant woman found to be using methamphetamine with a mandatory 3-year jail sentence. So in Idaho, they've gone in the direction of locking them up. Certainly no one who's familiar with this data would recommend that as a policy. California, in the criminal justice system, meth is a huge problem. I don't need to tell you that. Addict inmates, you'll see about half of them are meth users. So with the huge number of people we have in prisons in California, methamphetamine is a gigantic problem. We know that recidivism rates with meth users are somewhat higher than with other drugs, and violence rates are also higher with meth using people with meth-related crimes. I'll talk about meth and HIV a bit. With meth and HIV, there's one population here in California at risk currently, and that's gay men who have sex with men. Injecting certainly does transfer HIV, and among meth injectors, there is an elevated rate of HIV risk, certainly. But the really big public health problem is among gay men. That's where we've seen the big data that unprotected sex with injection drug users, unprotected sex in general, increases the risk of HIV within the gay population, men who have sex with men. This is some data from Southern California, from a set of research we do in West Hollywood, which is a huge gay community in Los Angeles. If you go out on the street and you get in West Hollywood and you do just a general probability sample and ask verbally, so you're probably getting an underreporting of the number of people who have used meth in the last 30 days. In the general population, it's about 8% among gay men in general. About 26%, among the probabilistic sample, actually when you go out on the street and you talk to a random bunch of men in West Hollywood, you find that about a third of them are meth users, will report having used methamphetamine in the last 30 days. The use of meth in the gay community is truly epidemic. Within the group that are simply on the street, you get a positive HIV rate of about 8%. Among those that identify themselves as recreational meth users, the HIV rate is about 26%. For those people who are reportedly using but not in treatment, the rate's about 41%. Among those where their use has become so severe that they get pushed in the door of treatment, these are chronic treatment patients, chronic users who are in outpatient treatment, HIV rate is 62%. And among those who are in a residential setting because their use is so severe and they've got medical consequences, you get a rate of 90%. The longer you use methamphetamine, the greater is the chance that you're going to be HIV infected in the gay community. And here in San Francisco, there were data on, in the gay community, if you're a meth user, your rate of HIV is 3 times higher than if you're not a meth user. So there's a huge association within that community. In the heterosexual community, where the rates are much lower, obviously, we have not seen a link yet here in the United States between HIV and methamphetamine. But I think anyone would suggest it's a matter of time. It's not a matter of that heterosexuals are somehow invulnerable. In fact, I don't know where the slide went, but I have data on hepatitis C. Hepatitis C rates among meth users are substantial. About 20% of meth users in general are Hep C positive. Among injecting meth users, it's about 60%. So hepatitis and HIV are big issues around methamphetamine. Now, sexual behavior plays a role in transmission of HIV, transmission of all sexually transmitted diseases, obviously. We did a study to look at, it was our perception that this was a bigger deal with meth users than with other groups of drug users. We treated all kinds of drug users. So we did, about 3 years ago, we published a paper on the relationship between different kinds of drug use and sexual behavior. And we did a survey of 100 patients in our treatment centers in each of 4 groups: opiate addicts, alcoholics, cocaine users, and meth users, 50 men and 50 women of each group. And we asked them a whole set of questions about their particular drug use and their sexual behavior. What we got was this: when you ask opiate addicts, I am more likely to have sex when using heroin, very few of them will answer that yes. In fact, opiates replace sexual behavior. They don't enhance sex. You rarely hear a heroin addict talking about going out and getting loaded and having sex, unless they're prostituting for their drug, but the two are not particularly associated. Alcohol, you get an association a little bit higher for women than for men. With cocaine, you get a big association between men and sexual frequency of sexual behavior, but not with women. With methamphetamine, you get it with both, and higher than with any of the other drugs. If you look at other dimensions like this, like my sex drive is increased, opiates are low. Alcohol, you get some response with women. Cocaine, you get a response with men. With methamphetamine, you get a response from both. This difference right here surprised us. The fact that women reported, we knew that we'd worked with cocaine users a long time, male cocaine users, and this was pretty well documented, that sex and cocaine go together for men, but not for women. But with methamphetamine, it's both. My sexual pleasure is enhanced by the use of opiates low, alcohol relatively low, cocaine for men, but not for women, methamphetamine for both, and my sexual performance. And here you see, with cocaine, many of the men initially find it helpful and stimulating and produces better sex in their early use. But by the time they're using chronically, it often will interfere with their sexual behavior, cause impotence, they can't sustain an erection. With methamphetamine, we don't see nearly as much of that. It can occur in later stages where men will lose the ability to maintain an erection, but in general, meth and sex stay connected, and you get a lot of sexual behavior with methamphetamine. That's why there's such concerns in South Africa, where you have lots of HIV in the community, and increasing the rate of high-risk sexual behavior is exactly the wrong drug in the wrong community at the wrong time. Some other effects, just to give you, these are some neuropsychological tests. I won't go into these in detail, but methamphetamine impairment, this is a percentage impaired in these different domains: attention, learning and memory, working memory, fluency of information, inhibition, your ability to inhibit yourself from making a response. All of those things are impaired by methamphetamine. Frontal lobe functioning, that part of the brain with the blue blob on it is part of that I showed you that's affected by methamphetamine. It's part of the frontal lobe. It's definitely impaired by methamphetamine. which is probably why we see meth users with many of these deficits in executive tasks. And as long as the brain is impaired, this months of recovery, you're going to see all of these things being problematic, which may have something to do with some of the treatment problems we see. Gender differences. At admission, we did a study with 1,000 patients where we looked at a set of psychological symptoms at baseline, at admission to treatment. Higher numbers indicate more severe symptoms. In all of the domains, from somaticism, obsessive compulsive, interpersonal sensitivity, depression, anxiety, hostility, all of them, you see significantly, and these are very significantly higher numbers for women than for men. Women come into treatment with much more psychological distress than do men. It's just been shown in other areas, but it's particularly marked, because these are large samples. These are 500 women and 500 men. These differences are very significant, not just statistical differences, but real-world differences. The Beck Depression Inventory at admission. Again, this average is about 12, which is a fairly elevated Beck Depression score, but with women the average is about 17, which is a much greater amount of depression. So it means that when women walk in the door of treatment centers, female meth users, depression and many of these emotional things are going to be much more severe problems, certainly in the early treatment. When we look at reasons why people start, there's a whole bunch of them that are similar for men and women. Two stand out as being different. You see far more women, in this sample about 35% report meth use. They first started being attracted to meth because of its properties of weight loss. That's much less of a big deal to men. Also, you see this issue in treatment. When women start getting into recovery and they start gaining weight, it can often be an issue around relapse because they get distressed at seeing their weight come back on. And also depression. There's a big literature on this that among substance abusing women, the rates of depression are much higher. And that's true here as well. You see more women saying, I took the drug because it helped me with my depression than among men. Treatment. These are some of the things that we need to develop treatment for. Overdose, psychosis, withdrawal, getting people sober, keeping them sober, and some of the problems they have with their brain as they're in early recovery. The treatments for overdose are relatively standard and have been pretty standard for the last 10 or 15 years. In most cases, the major issues, they're either having seizures or their body temperature is very high and their body temperatures needs to be brought down. More often in emergency rooms, what is seen is meth psychosis, where people are brought in tweaking, where they're psychotic, they are seeing things or hearing voices, or floridly psychotic. Different emergency rooms have different protocols, although if they can be sort of just calmed down and kept in a quiet room until the drug is metabolized out, that's sort of usually the standard procedure. But they also use antipsychotics with them to sort of slow them down and keep them from hurting themselves. And those in Harbor, UCLA, down in Los Angeles, they see about 5 a day that are brought in, where they have to sort of keep them in a quiet room for 23 hours while their brain gets back to normal. Of course, the state of our healthcare system is they don't ever get into treatment. They go out and then within 3 or 4 days they're back again, cycling through. Meth withdrawal, it's not like heroin withdrawal. People don't have severe physical symptoms with meth withdrawal the way they do with a drug like heroin or even alcohol, but they're not very comfortable. Depression, fatigue, anxiety, low energy, all of those are extremely severe during the early 2 days to 2 weeks. Paranoia is almost universal. Sometimes it's florid paranoia where they have whole delusional systems. Other times it's just sort of an uneasiness that They know somebody's talking about them or watching them or in the next room listening to them. And that can often last for a couple of weeks. Actually, that can often last months into recovery. It sort of comes and goes. We used to think that was because people would relapse, and so they would, if they got paranoid again, that meant they'd relapse. But we've actually seen it over enough time that we realize that some people experience these paranoid episodes almost like flashbacks. They haven't relapsed, but they start to feel the paranoia again. We're not sure quite why, but that can persist for some time. Most meth users who become psychotic, if you put them in a closed setting or quiet place, over 24 hours, their psychosis will abate on its own. About half of 1% of the adults who become psychotic stay psychotic. Now, we don't know why that is. It may have been that there are people who were pre-schizophrenic and methamphetamine kicked off a schizophrenic condition. We're not sure, but it's a relatively small number. Most meth psychosis does resolve. In Thailand, where we're doing a big project, and the average age of the Thai meth users is about 18 years old. That's the mean age, which means half of them are younger than that. We see about 7% of them being continuing to be psychotic. The psychiatric hospitals in Thailand are full of adolescent meth users over chronic treatment because they don't get well. Antipsychotics don't appear to work for them. We're not sure why the Thai users are more susceptible to persistent psychosis than in U.S. There's three explanations right now. One is that it's a different drug, that the yaba that they use is somehow different than the meth we use here, which seems like it should be an easily testable issue. Just get some yaba, put it in a lab, test it next to the meth, and see if it's the same drug. That's harder than you would think, to bring in yaba and test it. There are laws against doing that. My partner, Walter Ling, who's Thai, who is the doctor for some of the royal family in Thailand, and the Princess of Thailand comes regularly to see him, has tried to talk her into carrying some in her purse, but I told him that's a bad idea. Anyway, we haven't tested it. One explanation is they're using a different drug. The second explanation is that their genes are different, that there's something genetically about the Thais that put them at high risk for developing persistent psychosis. The third one, the one that probably has the most relevance here in the U.S., is that they're younger and smaller and users, and that if adolescents use methamphetamine, they're more likely to develop a persistent psychosis. That's the third explanation. We don't know which one of those explanations is correct, but if it's the third one, that's a big concern here, given that we're starting to see more adolescents using methamphetamine. There was just a recent national report by my colleagues at the Office of National Drug Control in Washington saying, among adolescents, we're not seeing any evidence of meth use. A lot of pot use, some prescription drug use, no meth use. We sent them data from California of adolescent treatment admissions in the last 3 years. And last year, almost a third of the adolescent admissions were for meth in California treatment programs. And if you look among girls admitted to California treatment programs, it's over half. So we are seeing adolescents use meth, particularly among girls. Girls are at very high risk, especially Hispanic young women. For some reason, it's become very popular in that community. And if we're going to do prevention, that's where we should be aiming our prevention efforts right now. But in any event, we don't know whether we're going to see a replication of the Thai psychosis issue here in the U.S. or not. Medications. We've been looking for medications. We would give anything to find medicine like methadone for treating methamphetamine users, but we don't have anything. There are no medications right now with demonstrated efficacy for treating meth users, to reduce their craving, to reduce their withdrawal symptoms, to help them stay sober. There are no medicines. These are some of the ones we've been testing. We run NIDA's, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, contracts with us to run a multi-site project where we test medicines. We've tested these already in our centers and in other centers and found that they don't work for meth use. These are currently, this one's been tested actually, and we just actually reported out data on bupropion on 2 studies. This is a drug called Wellbutrin, used for the treatment of depression, cigarette smoking. It's called Zyban, but the generic name is bupropion. Tom Newton in the inpatient lab, working with it next door to us, found that if you give people bupropion and they take methamphetamine, it reduces the amount of reward they get from it. Meth doesn't make them feel as good. We've just finished with Ahmed Elkashev at NIDA a study, an outpatient trial with 150 meth users, half get placebo, half get bupropion, and we found a particularly strong effect with meth users, where particularly those who are not the very severe users, not the injecting daily users, but the people who use episodically do get a benefit from methamphetamine. This isn't yet published. It's currently under review. But this is the first signal we've had that a medicine might be useful for methamphetamine. And if so, that would be helpful. And we're currently looking for other medications. There are some populations that require special treatment considerations, some meth populations. That includes female meth users. As I mentioned, they're going to come in with higher rates of violence, very high rates of previous and current sexual and physical abuse. Many of the women who come into treatment come out of extremely abusive environments. If they're cooking meth, if they're involved with somebody else who's cooking it, violence. And so a lot of the trauma work that's currently being done, there's a woman named Lisa Najovitz from Harvard who's published something called Seeking Safety, which is treatment materials you can buy. I think Hazelden now publishes it. That is working with women who have been traumatized and who are addicted, and as they get them into treatment. I think that's an extremely useful protocol for meth-using women, because you see such a high rate of violence among that population. And you see high rates of depression. And of course, women often can be somewhat more reluctant to enter treatment. Although I have to say, in the populations that we've looked at for 10 or 15 years, I was used to looking at heroin users and cocaine users where it was 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 men to women. In the meth populations, it's almost 50-50. There's almost as many women as men, so you see a lot of women entering treatment. And of course, they often have responsibility for kids, and so there's a lot of special considerations. Treatment programs really need to pay some attention to gearing up special treatment stuff for female meth users. Injection users, as I'll show you, everything about injection users is worse. They're crazier, they're more addicted, they have more craving, they have higher rates of HIV and hepatitis, they have worse withdrawal syndromes, their treatment outcome is poorer. For the most part, if I was in charge of things, I would start virtually all injection meth users in some kind of residential setting to give them a chance. They're generally just too disoriented. If you look at the data over time and you look at treatment outcome, the dropout rates of injection meth users in outpatient treatment during the first month is 80-90% in some samples. It's very difficult to engage them in treatment, directly into outpatient treatment, partly because they're so crazy and their craving is so severe. That's not to say that smokers are easy to treat. They've got similar levels of problems, but injectors particularly stand out as a difficult group. If you look at all the data on all the meth studies, what predicts poor outcome, the one thing that we found in addition to this is daily users. If somebody's a daily user and uses every day, sort of the way people take heroin or smoke cigarettes, where they use it on a maintenance basis, those people have poorer outcomes. Again, this is probably a group that needs more intensive treatment. at the front end of treatment to get them into treatment, because the big place you lose these guys is in the first month. Obviously, people homeless, chronically mentally ill, have greater challenges, special treatment needed. Adolescents and young adults, and certainly gay men, where you have to put a tremendous emphasis on HIV prevention. My colleagues, and you can go to our website, I'll show it at the end, and you can get a manual. We've produced manuals for working with this population, because you really can't use standard materials. Sex is such a big part of their addiction to methamphetamine. You have to blend that material together as you're doing the treatment, because sex becomes as big an issue as their drug use, if not bigger. Okay, what are the treatments that work for meth users? Well, because of this problem we've had, getting methamphetamine onto the national agenda, there hasn't been a lot of study of that issue until the last 5 years. Before that, though, we did have about 15 years of data collection looking at cocaine treatment outcome. And with cocaine, these are some of the techniques that have clear empirical support. And you can get manuals for all of these things from SAMHSA and from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. There's a lot of treatment material. Hazelden has a bunch of stuff. There's good material out on motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, this approach by Steve Higgins at Vermont, community reinforcement, contingency management, which is a reward system, something called 12-step facilitation, and a model that we've developed, the matrix model. All of those have good data to support their use with cocaine users. Why do I mention that? Well, we've now in 4 studies in the same clinics with the same staff at the same time using the same treatment protocol looked at treatment outcome with cocaine users and meth users right side by side, the same, with everything the same. And the treatment outcome is identical using these behavioral treatments. We think there's enough evidence now to say that the data on these treatments that are supported for cocaine use should be considered applicable to meth users. That is, that we don't need to go back through and do another 15 years of research to be able to say that these things also are useful for treating meth users. We feel like we're on pretty good ground saying, even though the data are with cocaine, these results apply pretty much with meth. There are some differences. I mean, clearly the brain is affected differently. It's a longer recovery. There's more women involved. There's some definite, sex is more of a big deal with meth. But in general, you're not going to go wrong using these treatment approaches with meth users. There's actually only 2 treatments where we have data for meth specifically. One of those is a technique called contingency management. This is a very simple technique. It's positive reinforcement. It's taking a behavior that you want to get with a drug user, like getting clean urines, and rewarding them for it. Setting up some kind of reward system so when they show up for treatment and they give a clean urine, something good happens. Some places have vouchers. Some people give people privileges. Some people have a point system. There's all kinds of ways of doing this, but clearly this works. Contingency management is a fancy name for it, but it's all about finding behaviors that you want to increase and rewarding them. Drug abuse treatment, for those of you who have done drug abuse treatment for a long time, when I first started doing drug abuse treatment, I was telling somebody the other day, the first place I ever went for drug abuse treatment was a place at Camarillo State Hospital where they had a program called The Family, which was a therapeutic community. People had shaved heads and they were wearing signs around that said, you know, I'm a bad guy, don't talk to me. And treatment was all about confronting people, breaking through their denial, rebuilding their character, and it was sort of the standard was you really weren't doing good drug abuse treatment if you didn't beat them up and hit them on the head with their bad behavior and confront them and use lots of negative reinforcement. If they screw up, you kick them out of treatment. One of the things that really never really made its way very widely into treatment was positive reinforcement. Find them doing something right and reward them for it. Even though in AA, there's a lot of that. People get chips, they get cakes, people get lots of social reinforcement for sobriety. In our treatment system, we seem to focus more on negative contingencies than positive contingencies. The data with meth users, and this isn't specific to methamphetamine, say that if you focus on specific positive behaviors and reward them, you're going to get what you want more often. Attendance at treatment, clean urines, getting them to new behavioral things that you want them to do, go to meetings. If you can incentivize them some way, you'll get an increase in behavior. It's a very simple principle. It's the same one that teachers use when they put stars on charts if you get an A on your spelling test. I mean, that parents use in child rearing, same principle. And it's often used sort of informally in treatment programs, but the data here with meth users said if you really want to pick the single technique that's going to give you the best outcome, this would be it. These are some data from a couple of studies we've done. Clean urines. This was a control group that was getting counseling over a 20-week or 25-week treatment program. We got about 10 clean urines from this group. This group, we got about 20 clean urines. These guys got rewards for giving clean urines. A similar one, weeks of consecutive abstinence. This group gave you about they were taking urines 3 times a week. Here you get about 1 week of consecutive abstinence. This is all on an outpatient basis, obviously. With contingency management in this trial, you could get an average of 4 weeks of consecutive clean urines. These are standard meth users. These aren't special guys. These are routine Rancho Cucamonga, plain vanilla meth users. This is, I'm going to talk to you about the matrix model, which is something we've done, which is a counseling and behavioral treatment approach. This is with half of these patients were in the matrix model. The guys in the yellow, they were all in the matrix model. The green bar also got contingencies on top of the matrix model. And you can see number of clean urines over the 16 weeks. In the matrix model, we got about 10. If you added contingency management, you bumped it up to about 14. Taken once a week, that's 14 out of 16 clean urines. This is the longest duration abstinent, that is how long is the longest period of time they got during their treatment. With matrix, it's about 5 weeks with, or 5 samples in a row. With contingency management, you almost double that. It works. It's a technique that works. If this was a medicine and it went to the FDA, you'd have a measure of efficacy. Contingency management would be on your shelves as an effective medicine for treating meth users. This is a study that we did. I'll wrap up with some of the data with this. This is a study done here in California a few years ago and with sites in Honolulu and Billings, Montana. Treated 1,000 patients, average age 32. 12th grade education, using meth for about 7 years. Over half were women, 60% Caucasian, but a pretty good number of Hispanics and Asian Pacific Islanders. This is so high because one of the sites was Hawaii and one was San Mateo, where we saw lots of Filipino individuals. 2/3 of them smoked the drug, although a quarter of them injected. These were mostly in Billings, Montana. In some parts of the Northwest, Oregon around through Montana, about half of the people inject up there. And if you go to the Midwest and in the upper Midwest, the Dakotas, about half the people inject. And most of them are HIV, or most of them are Hep C positive. Those states are going to have huge healthcare burdens in the next 10 years treating all their Hep C positive individuals. Okay, what did we find? The way the study worked, in each of the 8 sites, they had 2 programs. One was their standard program, whatever it was they did for outpatient treatment. The other was the matrix approach. Now, the matrix treatment approach, we've got manuals and we published papers on it, is a combination of things. Includes cognitive behavioral therapy, 12-step participation, family therapy, education, urine testing, and it's all structured and manualized. There's a manual that lays it all out for people. So if you walked into the program and you volunteered to be in the study, you could get randomly assigned into either condition in each of the 8 clinics. So we had 8 clinics doing 2 treatments. They came in 16 weeks of treatment. We followed them at 16 weeks, 6 months, and 12 months. Collected urines from them at all those follow-up points. When we looked across the entire 1,000 patients, at admission they were using about 11 days a month. At discharge they were using about 4 days, at 16 weeks. Now, that is a highly significant reduction, but what it doesn't really reflect very well, and I have to fix and get the other slide, is it went from everybody using at admission to about half of the people not using it all in the last 30 days at discharge. So even though it's an average of 4 days, it reflects half of the people going to 0 and the other half that didn't respond very well. But this is across both treatment conditions, matrix and treatment as usual. Similarly, across everybody, you get a big reduction in depression from admission to discharge. Using that brief symptom inventory, you get a big reduction in other psychological symptoms. That is an improvement in those symptoms. When we looked at weeks in treatment, retention, and if there's one thing you want to do with meth users in terms of treating them, it's retain them in treatment. If they stay in treatment, things get better. If they drop out of treatment or if you kick them out of treatment, things get worse. The sort of basic rule now in drug abuse treatment is if you want to keep them alive, keep them in treatment. That if treatment is about nothing else other than reducing mortality from drug use, focus on retention. If you look at retention here, this is number of weeks in treatment, and maybe a little bit hard to see. The blue bars are the matrix group. The white bars are treatment as usual. In 7 of the 8 sites, we got better retention with the matrix treatment group. In all the sites except this one right here in Hayward. Anybody want to venture a guess why that is? These guys were all in a drug court. The rest of them, the other 7 sites, were all in voluntary treatment. Peggy Hora's drug court, they volunteered to be in this study, and they volunteered their drug court program. If you notice, there's no difference between treatments, but that both groups are retained longer than all the other groups and all the other sites. Drug court actually overwhelmed the benefits of the differential treatment response. If you look at clean urines during this 16-week trial, you get exactly the same picture. In the matrix group, you get more clean urines during the course of treatment. In Hayward, you get no difference, and you get more clean urines, actually almost double as many clean urines in Hayward as you do in the voluntary sites. When we looked at the severity of the patients, all their background characteristics, these guys are just as severe, if not more severe actually, than these guys. It's made a believer out of me. If I was king, I would and I wanted to treat meth users, I'd put a lot of money into drug courts. I think they're a very effective tool for treating meth users. Now, that shows you the during treatment effects. And this is another one, percent completing treatment. 40% in the matrix group, 34% in treatment as usual. With 1,000 patients, it was highly significant. Everything during treatment suggested matrix treatment looked better at its effect than treatment as usual. However, at follow-up, 6 and 12 months, you get very similar effects. 11 days to 4 and 4. Oh, that's a discharge in 6 months. If you put 12 months, it would be the same thing. And treatment as usual, the same thing. The superior treatment benefit did not particularly produce a generalized benefit. We're not sure why that is, but if you look at these data, matrix group, percent who gave clean urines at discharge, 6 months, and 12 months. And we got urine samples on, it says over 80%. It's actually closer to 90% of the sample. We have like black belts in doing follow-up that go out and find these guys and get urines from them. We got clean urines from both groups at a rate of about 60% and at discharge and admission, but they're not significantly different. But you get a good, robust treatment effect with both groups. We think these data suggest that outpatient treatment, these different outpatient treatments appear to work well. During the treatment program, it looks as if there's some superior benefit to using a matrix model. At discharge and at follow-up, they both look like they work pretty well. So we're still figuring out exactly why the superior effect didn't appear to generalize. I've got 246 up here, is that right? Is that about right? Let me see, you got a bunch of other stuff. Let me just quickly go through some of these things. I mentioned there's a couple of things I wanted to point out with regard to route of administration. This one, injection drug users, smokers, intranasal users. Severity of psychiatric symptoms at admission, discharge, and the 2 follow-ups. The injection users are more severe than the smokers. The smokers are more severe than the intranasal users. That's a pattern you see pretty much throughout the data, although these 2 groups are really more similar. If you've got somebody that's taking methamphetamine orally, you do see a few that eat it, or if they take it through their nose, they're likely to have a pretty good prognosis. It's going to be better than with these other 2 routes of administration. Unfortunately, smoking is by far the most popular. Depression symptoms, the same thing. Let me... this was the data I mentioned, the cocaine and meth use. This is from a sample with 500 cocaine users and 500 meth users looking at retention and treatment in a 16-week outpatient program, and you see you get slightly, although not significantly, better retention among meth users than cocaine. So this idea that meth users respond more poorly to treatment is simply not supported by any data that we can find. Jim Sorensen did a similar study here in San Francisco up the road and found very similar data. I think part of the reason that belief system has developed is because in many places in the U.S., particularly rural areas, they've never seen anything like meth before. And when meth users started coming in, their experience had been a few prescription drug users, pot smokers, and alcoholics, and they'd never seen meth users drug users like this, and they just got freaked out. And there started to be developing this myth that meth users are somehow untreatable. There's really no evidence for that at all. Let me switch to the groups that we're seeing increasing use on are right now are in the Hispanic community. In the African American community, there's still very little methamphetamine use. The debate about why that is starting to get very interesting. We always thought it was simply sociological, that because African American communities have been so impacted by the cocaine epidemic and the crack epidemic, you already have the market carved out there for stimulants, and meth would be used in the suburbs and rural areas by the white guys. And that's still the leading explanation, although the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse is starting to look at genetic explanations, that maybe somehow the drug affects the brain differently, that African Americans get more dysphoria from methamphetamine, so they don't like it as well. It's an interesting debate, still right at the beginning of it. There's not a lot of evidence of people switching. We thought that maybe all these cocaine users would switch over to meth. They seem to be pretty much 2 different populations. This is some of the research that is currently going on, and I said I would put up my website. That's actually the wrong email too. What you want is, If you want any of this information, I'd be happy to give it to you at my our website. It's on the first slide, I believe. That is not the right, I'm sorry, that's not the right, that's the correct email address. And the website, you can go on the website and download all of this stuff, including the brain pictures, www.uclaisap.org. Go on that website, go to presentations, and you will find all of this stuff plus a lot more that you can download and use in presenting to groups or patients or for your own information. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.